The G-Man is one of the most mysterious figures in all of gaming. The identity of him and his employers and what their motivations are have puzzled fans for 25 years now. Today, we're going to set out and try to unravel this mystery and answer as many questions as possible. But first, we need to talk about parallel universes. I'm kidding, that comes later. No, let's first start with the story of Half-Life and what it outright states about G-Man. Now I must make it clear, even if I state anything confidently as if it is a fact, all conclusions I come to are solely speculative and of my opinion. So, the Half-Life games start out with Gordon Freeman, the player character, running late to work at the Black Mesa Research Facility as the world's best paid grocery cart pusher. Black Mesa had been doing testing with crystals from Zen, which could be said to be a different dimension, or more precisely, a world between worlds. Now hold on to that, we will come back to it later. Gordon pushes his cart into the anti-mass spectrometer, and it goes wrong, causing a resonance cascade and opening a portal between Earth and Zen. I'm going to skip over a lot of events after this, giving the briefest summary to only discuss what is more relevant regarding the G-Man. If you'd like a more in-depth analysis of the entire timeline, please check out these videos. All links will be in the description. I just still feel it's important for me to go over the story briefly, so if I'm fundamentally misunderstanding the story, I can be properly called out for it. Gordon fights off the alien invasion and eventually travels to Zen to fight a baby. After he wins, and before DCFS shows up, the G-Man arrives and says that he and his employers are impressed and offer him a job. Gordon could either choose to accept or face a forced game over. The next time Gordon sees G-Man is about 5 seconds later, where G-Man decides to wake him up and drop him off 20 years later in City 17. Earth has been taken over by a bunch of farm equipment disguised as a multi-dimensional alien empire, and the administrator of Earth is Dr. Breen, who formerly was the administrator of Black Mesa. The G-Man leaves Gordon alone, and, much like the first game, watches him from afar, and once inside a piece of lab equipment. He only shows back up at the end of the game when Gordon pops Breen's bubble and is about to have another game over himself. The G-Man then initiates a cliffhanger, but at the start of the next installment, he's interrupted by a bunch of Vortigaunts, who again remember Gordon because of his
crowbar coming at them down a steel corridor.
They save him, and G-Man is annoyed. He doesn't show up at all until the next game when the Vortigaunts are distracted, where he reminds Gordon that Alyx Vance is an essential NPC. Timeline-wise, this is the last appearance of G-Man, sort of. However, he does appear and interact with other characters. For example, 5 years earlier in Half-Life Alyx, he appears at the very end of the game inside a gigantic bacteriophage. He decides to offer Alyx a job because Gordon's performance review was unsatisfactory. Alyx Vance and Dr. Breen have also alluded to having met G-Man. He speaks to Colonel Odessa Cubbage as well before Gordon arrives. He is also in Half-Life Opposing Force, rearming the nuke that you, Adrian Shepard, were trying to disarm, and then later offering you a job. He is also seen briefly in Blue Shift and Decay, and at the very start of the original Half-Life having a muffled argument with the scientist behind a window before everything falls apart. The canonicity of these expansions is uncertain, but for the sake of argument, we will be considering them canon today unless anything that is definitely canon specifically contradicts them. Even then, they'll be treated as secondary sources and not given as much weight. Otherwise, that is all the games openly tell us about the G-Man. So, let's take a look at the events and the context surrounding the G-Man's few appearances. First, G-Man is the one who gave the crystal to Black Mesa, where Breen conveniently decided to deviate from the standard analysis procedures and increase the power resolution, which is what led to the resonance cascade. So, we know the G-Man is responsible for this, and then he simply observed everything that happens, only intervening when Adrian Shepard tries to deactivate the nuke and when Gordon finally defeats the Nihilith. He also admits to saving Alyx Vance during the events, but most importantly, when speaking to Gordon, he notes that he and his employers now have control of Zen.
For the time being.
Now Zen is very interesting. No species are native there. According to a Vortigern mural, they had been hunted and chased by the Combine previously and, I'm supposing, teleported themselves to Zen, where they and all the other species were safe. It's my own personal headcanon that the Didnt invaded Black Mesa because they were afraid of the Combine using that opportunity to find and take over Zen. Which we could go into a whole nother deep dive about the Didnt and its motivations, but that can be for another time. Still, it is shown in Half-Life 2 that the Combine do not have access to local teleportation that Black Mesa had, which uses Zen as a relay. Their teleportation is very rudimentary in comparison and is more akin to drilling a hole into other universes. The one teleporter they are seen with takes Gordon and Alyx a whole week to teleport to the destination. Zen is a border world, and it exists between dimensions. Being a multiversal empire, the Combine having control of Zen would be very dangerous. So again, the G-Man starts the Black Mesa incident, nukes the facility, and is last seen when he and his employers now have control of Zen. The resonance cascade causes portal storms to start ravaging the Earth, which presumably brought over more aliens from Zen and other worlds. It is implied that the Combine either used or became aware of these, and then invaded the Earth. The G-Man then drops Gordon back off 20 years later, coincidentally on the day of his old co-workers, finishing and about to test their new teleporter. Which, is very interesting that G-Man dropped Gordon off on the day that he did this out of all the other 7,000 plus days that had passed and then 20 years. He then doesn't intervene, besides Odessa, until Gordon defeats Breen and causes the Citadel to explode. He then puts Gordon and Alyx in stasis, has his ending speech, and leaves, and then the Vortigerns rewind time and intervene to save them, which raises a lot of interesting questions. Let me ask, what would have happened had they not intervened if the original ending of Half-Life 2 was set in stone? Well, in the episodes of Half-Life 2, the remaining Combine forces are attempting to use the destruction of the Citadel to send a message to their off-world forces, and then to try and open a super portal as a last-ditch effort to invade Earth with a much larger force. Once in the game you stop them, you all try to make your way to the Borealis. However, if you were not there, then it's reasonable to assume that the entire Earth would have been overrun and the life wiped out. This is very notable because then there'd be no more humans left to make portal technology. And the Combine would not have had any access to it either. Except maybe the Borealis, but we'll get to that. Dr. Breen states during one of his Breencasts to the Overwatch that they could have taken Alyx Vance and the rest of the Black Mesa East team at any time. Given their background, it can be surmised that they were being allowed to live in hopes of being able to obtain their local teleportation technology. The next time the G-Man is seen is when the Vortigerns are trying to heal Alyx, in which he has to relay a cryptic message to her father.
Prepare for unforeseen consequences.
Son of a bitch, it is unforeseen.
Technically, he is next seen when her father doesn't die, but this event coincides with him 5 years in the past being released from a Combine prison fueled on Vortigern energy. Now put a pin in all that, we will come back to it and address all these points too. They're all very relevant. First, I'd like to discuss other theories on the G-Man, only to show why they aren't being considered first. There used to be the idea that he was Gordon Freeman from the future. There's literally no indication that could be true except the G in Gordon and the Man in Freeman. And, some fan mashups. He also shows little regard for humanity or life in general, implying that he's a being of higher form. When speaking of Eli and the advisors, he referred to them as
this entity will continue, and this entity will not.
When speaking of Gordon, he simply called him a
previous hire.
As mentioned when I brought up him saving Gordon and Alyx, humanity doesn't seem to be that important to him. Side note, he clearly is not allies with the Combine, nor do they have control of Zen. They literally tried to capture him, and he states that he and his employers are in control for the time being. I know it should be self-explanatory, but it's always better just to be completely sure. There also used to be a theory that he is another Nihilanth, presumably more mature and powerful. There is some nice evidence, but this is not the case. Nihilanth was the last of his kind. Gordon caused them to go extinct. It's been pretty definitively stated in the lore that he is the last. Finally, the G-Man is not a grown-up advisor. The Breen Grub Twitter account, while non-canon like a lot of my sources, provides a lot of interesting lore. It states that they are a very intelligent and powerful species and that they can decide their form upon hatching. But they are infected with a parasite and the Combine would have subjugated their race, preventing them from maturing. So, while it is possible the G-Man could be one, it is unlikely. He would have had to know the form of a human while a larvae and had his whole grand plan set in motion to eventually topple the Combine Empire. Not to mention that the advisors are most likely not even from our universe, as with the rest of the Combine. Again, G-Men seem to have little regard for them or life in general, referring to them as
this entity.
There also is a dead advisor found at the bottom of the room containing his vault. Fun fact, this is actually what prompted me to go into this deep dive and try to solve everything. That advisor is seldom mentioned online, but the developers have never removed it. And don't worry, I've tried to tell Valve. Nobody knows quite why it is there. Most likely it either died when the vault crashed or when the G-Man's energy was pulsing out, or he simply killed it himself. Regardless, it is much more likely he is not an advisor. So, what is he then? And what do his employers even want? It's not stated what species he is, if you can even call him a creature at all. So, as for their motives, I believe he and his employers primarily want control of Zen and to prevent lesser being from obtaining local teleportation, or at least a teleportation that gives them access to Zen. Again, in Blue Shift, he rearms a nuke to completely destroy Black Mesa. Had it been left around, the Combine would have gone through the ruins to gather Zen crystals and use the technology to create a teleporter. Furthermore, G-Man only drops Freeman off in City 17 when Kleiner was just about to test his new teleporter. At the end of Half-Life 2, with how events would have played out had the Vortigaunts not intervened, neither Combine nor humanity would have had access to local teleportation. They did interfere, however, and so that raises the question of what G-Man's plans are now. As shown in Episode 2 in Half-Life Alyx, G-Man is particularly interested in Alyx. Though I could be very well wrong. I think that he let himself be captured by the Combine 5 years in the past to enact his plans, and that the events of the game happen parallel to the events of Episode 2 to a certain degree. First, it's never stated how they even found him in the past, or even what he was doing at the time. It could be hypothesized that he was watching another exemplary person to offer them a job, or perhaps he released Adrian Shepard once again for a job, which would be really cool. After all, there was that cancelled Half-Life game where he dropped him in Ravenholm after Gordon had traveled through it. It's equally possible that he was there to give Dr. Kleiner Gordon's suit, since at the end of the first game he says,
As for the suit, I think you've earned it.
And yet, in Half-Life 2, Gordon reappears in City 17 in standard civilian clothing and has to be given the suit by Dr. Kleiner, who conveniently held on to Gordon's suit for the past 20 years in the hopes that he would travel from New Mexico all the way over to Eastern Europe, and that the suit still fits him. It is more likely that the G-Man made sure it fell into his hands somehow. However, given that the G-Man has been pulling the strings for the past 20 years, it's more likely that he simply let himself be captured at the same moment the Vortigaunts were interfering with his plans in Episode 1. When speaking to the Vortigaunts, they state that they are all connected through the Vortessence. In some ways, it is like a hive mind, but they are still individuals. They speak of being able to see Gordon
still in Black Mesa. Clearly we see you in the Nihilanth's chamber. We are there still in observance of your final stroll.
This implies that they see and are present in both the past and future in the eyes of other Vortigaunts. Gary's mural in Half-Life Alyx also depicts the events not only in their past, but their future as well, and when speaking to him.
I have a brain injury.
Despite being cut off from the Vortessence, he seems to be very confused as to what is the now.
and
Likewise, G-Man states in episode 2 that
I had to wait until your friends were otherwise occupied.
and that
I have agreed to abide by certain restrictions.
naturally, that raises the question of how he would be able to do any of this while trapped in the vault. First of all, his power is already overwhelming it enough, that is, leaking out of the chamber, and eventually he would break free. Secondly, he does not seem fazed or bothered at all by being in the vault. Granted, it could just be his natural demeanor or because he already knows that Alyx would be able to release him. However, the developers have stated, even if jokingly, they did consider an ending where the G-Man removes the Combine off Earth, as Alyx had asked. So it's not unreasonable given that scale of power that him being in the vault was something that he was only allowing to happen to him.
We had to communicate the important concepts of the vault through the use of visual effects, physics, sound design, and music. The most important concept was that the errant bursts of uncontrolled energy causing anti-reality events was spillover of the Vortigaunt energy being used to keep the prisoner in the vault, as his influence occasionally gained the upper hand through cracks in the field.
Now, I did not have a third point, so the conclusion that I am jumping to is then that upon being stopped by the Vortigaunts in episode 1, the G-Man orchestrated the events that followed and let himself be captured and waited for Alyx to become mortally wounded and in need of the Vortigaunt healing so that he could have a heart-to-heart with Gordon Freeman to make sure that Alyx makes it to White Forest so she can watch her father die. So he could use that for leverage for her 5 years in either the past or an alternate timeline. Sound confusing? Very much so. But it's either that or this is all a very, very large series of coincidences that just happen to work out in the favor of the guy who has been pulling all the strings in the background for the last 20 years or so. So what does he want with Alyx then? And why is he so invested in her? Well, in Epistle 3, which is explicitly non-canon, he still ends up taking Alyx at the very end. For a brief synopsis, in that Gordon and Alyx both travel to the Borealis, which is a ship from Aperture Science Laboratories, and has a special device on it which is causing it to teleport not just through space, but also time. The Combined Forces, what remain on Earth, are very interested in it. Long story short, at the end, Alyx turns the boat into a time-traveling bomb and launches it at the Combine homeworld. It crashes into a Dyson sphere and barely affects it. G-Man takes Alyx and then the Vortigaunts take Gordon. If you take this as the original or potential canon in that all the characters are acting as they would in those scenarios given their lore and backstories, it would seem as if this is why the G-Man was originally invested in Alyx, or why he wanted her to make it to White Forest. He wanted her to destroy this incredibly powerful device that could teleport anywhere at any time, and so by hiring her afterwards, that means that they were going to keep Alyx around for similar activities. So it could very well be the reason that is why he hires her in Half-Life Alyx. Going further into my own headcanon and back to the beginning where I said I would talk about parallel universes, I do like to believe that the events of Epistle 3 and as well as the original Half-Life expansion are all canon, but they don't explicitly have to follow within the main timeline of the story or even in the same universe for that reason. There is no reason G-Man cannot observe things from multiple places and multiple times. There isn't any reason to assume that when we put the crystal into the test chamber that this was his first time observing it. It honestly could have been his 100th go-around just to make sure things turn out perfectly. Alternate realities and timelines have already been established anyway, so this would help explain why Valve doesn't really like to discuss what is and what isn't canon. Now, one big final question and hurdle that throws a wrench into my theory is Portal, as very obviously you deal with teleportation the entire time and at no point is G-Man showing up and making a mess of things. In fact, it seems quite odd that he never met with Cape Johnson or made his presence known in the series. However, lack of proof is not proof itself. He very well could have done something off screen. He could have been the one to convince Cape Johnson to buy the moon rocks, or had a hand in GLaDOS becoming what she was. Or maybe he observed them and realized that Aperture Science would take care of its own portal problem. After all, everyone dies, and it falls to ruins all on its own. Shell was the only sane human left, and the rest of the facility existed solely for testing purposes. It would never need to do anything further, and most likely would eventually degrade and be lost to the eons. There was also cut dialogue in Portal 2 that suggested G-Man did visit, although this may have been more of a tongue-in-cheek Easter egg. If he was seriously concerned about Aperture, I'm sure he would have done something. After all, the technology would have proven invaluable to the Combine. I'm speaking strictly of the portal gun and the Borealis, and, perhaps GLaDOS' AI itself. The Combine already have their own energy balls and hard light bridges, unless GLaDOS did give them to the Combine as a way of keeping them distracted, which is possible. However, it's more likely they developed it on their own, as the ending of Portal 2 seems to indicate that the facility housing the portal gun and everything in it were hidden deep underground. GLaDOS also comments that she is actively keeping them out.
Are you trying to escape? Things have changed since the last time you left the building. What's going on out there will make you wish you were back in here. I have an infinite capacity for knowledge, and even I'm not sure what's going on outside. All I know is I'm the only thing standing between us and them. Well, I was. Unless you have a plan for building some supercomputer parts in a big hurry, this place isn't going to be safe much longer.
And Half-Life Alyx seems to indicate that North America, where Aperture Labs resides, is completely destroyed. The Perpetual Testing Initiative somewhat throws a wrench in all that though, but we will address that in a moment. The last thing I would like to add is, while also non-canon, in 2016 Mark Layalot did publish on his blog a series of text documents regarding the ending of Half-Life 1, which were made in 1998, late in its development. There's a lot of interesting material in it all, but I would like to read an excerpt from File 2, Nylanth. Teleportation has been mastered by a chain of super-intelligent, compared to us, aliens. Mainly, they use it to exploit and enslave the races they encounter. Their exploitation may be open, or it may be extremely covert, involving political manipulation of the worlds they control. It all depends on what they want out of the species they intend to dominate. The civilizations which are potentially the most dangerous, and also the most useful to them, are those which have independently arrived at the creation of teleport technology, which could surpass their own. For, as in all things, even advanced alien superscience is bound to become obsolete. And the drive for a more powerful technology is unending. Earth is at exactly this point. We made a few strong experimental forays into the science of teleportation, began to discover the practical underpinnings of the art, and then succeeded against our wildest dreams, stumbling into a weird dimension whose properties defied our understanding of natural law. Nor were we alone in this realm, which we named Zen, for that which is forever alien and inexplicable. Zen proved to be a meeting place, a point where universes collided and hung in endless freefall. The elements of countless worlds intermingled. No sooner had we begun to explore Zen, with particular attention to its wealth of natural resources, with unknown properties, than we found ourselves the object of unwanted inspection. Members of the survey team were collected in a cold and systematic manner, much as we gathered living specimens of alien wildlife. Realizing our precarious situation, we shut the portal completely, stranding the last members of the survey team and forcing them to survive alone in Zen. But shutting our gate was not enough, for now the predators of Zen had traced our signal, found our location, and come looking for us. The only hope seemed to be to find their portal and close that down from Zen itself, but we had lost contact with the survey team and there's no one willing to cross over until Gordon Freeman reached the Lambda portal. Eventually he reached the portal and killed the Nylanth, which held the portal in existence by a concentrated effort of thought. but there is a deeper mystery awaiting him on his return to Earth. We had been pointed to Zen, all our efforts aimed there, rather than a random fumbling through the white noise of possible cosmos which the teleport might have reached. We had settled immediately on Zen. The cause of this was a certain element found in Zen which had been made part of the portal's tuning mechanism. It was introduced into the portal research with the pedigree of a man-made compound, something created in a separate research facility. But actually, it was imported to Earth by a devious route, involving several of the aforementioned and super intelligent alien races. By steering us to Zen, they immediately forced a confrontation with a troublesome race which would either annihilate us or force us to show our mettle. If the former were the case, then they were rid of a pest. If the latter, then they would further shroud their presence in secrecy and work the manipulation deeper into the fabric of our society in hopes of harnessing us from within. The G-Man is redacted. Teleportation is only the first of many new empowerments for humanity. Greater surprises await us as we begin to plumb the depths of the universe, finding in Zen the gateways to all other worlds. For Zen is the way station, essential to all travel that takes us out of this universe and into the next. Whoever controls Zen controls all the worlds, and the battle for Zen is just beginning. It will rage on Earth, it will rage on the Zen, and it will consume entire realities before it ends. Now, obviously not all concepts and plot elements in here are used. He even admits it seems more like an attempt to sum up the ending thematically, and also it was an attempt at whipping up some marketing. Not sure who the audience was for this piece. Was it intended only for internal consumption? Were we trying to explain the story to others? I see in this, at this remove, the first hint that we were starting to look beyond Half-Life 1 at what the next threat might be. It was nothing as coherent as a Combine, and in fact, for a while, it weaved through all kinds of aliens at the problem before settling on a unified force. So, it should all be taken with a grain of salt regarding everything presented so far, especially since if it were a massive spoiler, it probably wouldn't have been posted in the first place. However, the race they were trying to write about seems to have morphed into the Combine, and it is a bit suspicious the narrative of these aliens that are preventing civilizations from achieving teleportations fits very well with what seems to be the goal of the G-Man and his employers. Not only that, but they do have control of Zen as well. So, before I go into 100% speculation, let's address all of the flaws and holes in my theory. One could say I'm reading too much into the story and trying to fit lore where there isn't any, or that a majority of my sources are non-canon, or even that it seems a little simplistic for that to be their motives, especially since the G-Man at least appears to be able to control time as well as space. I mean, preventing other civilizations from being able to teleport seems trivial compared to that kind of power. It also doesn't explain what he and his players are and why he works for them, or why the Vortigaunts haven't been pushed to extinction since they themselves can teleport, not to mention Aperture's perpetual testing initiative. So, while it is essentially a creator/level editor for Portal 2 and runs off the idea that there is an infinite number of universes with an infinite number of Aperture science facilities, which also means an infinite number of teleportation devices, which could poke an infinite number of holes in my theory. To everything I say, you're right. These are flaws. These are holes. I'm not going to disagree on that. Although I will say that I'm sure that, if the G-Man is a multiversal entity, the ones where Aperture Science posed an issue, it could have been dealt with on an individual basis, and also the Vortigaunts. We've only been shown a few of the universes so far. It's still very possible that they don't pose a threat at all, or that they've been severely underestimated by everyone. Regardless, I have a feeling that they will pose to be very important in the next game. I would like to add that it is very interesting that the Combine have not been able to successfully add the Vortigaunts into their ranks. They've merely only been able to enslave them. They've tried experimenting on them, as we've seen with Nova Prospect, and Gary, who stands out because he's been cut off from the Vort's essence. This leads me to believe that the Combine are very interested in the Vortigons and their abilities, like teleportation, but simply cannot get them to crack, most likely due to the Vort's essence. Because in the process of having them join the Combine ranks, it involves a loss of identity to varying degrees, but the Vortigons already belong to a collective, one that transcends space and time, and it's such a part of their identity that removing them from it is basically akin of removing a turtle from its shell. Not that they would die, but it is an integral part of their being. The Vort's essence itself would be an invaluable tool if the Combine could harness it, but given its nature, they cannot use it whatsoever. Now, for anyone who says it is more likely that the G-Man is an advisor, I would like to remind you that your primary source is a non-canner Twitter or X thread. Granted, half my sources are also non-canonical, but that's like saying I'm crazier because my hat has more tinfoil on it. So, since we're on the subject of crazy, let's go over some of my more wild and speculative theories that I've formed. I want to make it clear that I'm not saying I wholeheartedly believe any of these, but they are intriguing and, an entertaining hypothesis. First, what really is a G-Man as employers? As you may have noticed, for this entire video, I have completely avoided it. And that's because there's nothing in canon that talks about it, explicitly. Honestly, using all the evidence provided, it seems more likely that they are just simply beings completely above our level of understanding, and the shape we see G-Man in is either our brain's best interpretation of it or his attempt to appear passively human. That said, I really like the idea that he is the devil, or more specifically, Diablo Ex Machina. What is that? Well, Deus Ex Machina is Latin for God from the machine, which basically is when a problem in a story is resolved by seemingly impossible means. I'm butchering the definition, but a good example is literally the ending of Half-Life 2 when you defeat Breen in the Citadel as it's about to explode and G-Man stops time. However, instead of God saving you, I'm suggesting it is more of a literary devil. Not only that, but it could be said that he's making deals with others that seemingly cost them everything. The ending of Half-Life Alyx is a perfect example. He offers to save Eli in exchange for basically Alyx's life and future. Not technically her soul, but there's not much more that I think she could give. Black Mesa also must have reached an agreement with him to obtain the Zen Crystal for their testing, which ultimately led to the events of Half-Life 1 and the dystopian future that awaited the Earth. I remember hearing long ago on some theory that it was possible Breen had also made some sort of deal with him in order to become the administrator of Earth, and that one of the main supporting evidences is that he knew of the G-Man's existence and that Gordon's services were offered to him at one point.
How about it, Dr. Freeman? Did you realize your contract was open to the highest bidder?
I'm not sure how valid it is, given that, he was already aware of the G-Man in Half-Life 1, but it is a fun idea anyway. Not only that, but in episode 133 of the Kiwi Talks YouTube channel's interviews, series writer Eric Wolpaw literally refers to the G-Man as
you kind of let Satan or God or whatever you want to call him out.
There's also a bunch of other symbolism throughout the entire series, hyping up Gordon as some sort of messianic figure, especially to the Vortigons, who seem to have spent much of their history enslaved by others. But that is probably more literary symbology and coincidence, not literal or thematic symbology, if that makes sense. I also like to think that the G-Man is more of a contractor for his employees. Not that they are necessarily more powerful than him, but more so that they have made a deal with him and hired him because of his extraordinary abilities. Another hypothesis I have, which I'll need to do a lot more research on, is that the Combine are not a race, as in there is not a physical master race at the top commanding them all. I've seen a lot of people misattributing the advisors as their leaders, but they're literally just their namesake. It's spelled out and made pretty clear. They are advisors. So what I am proposing is that the Combine are their technology. I realize that one of the main features binding all the species underneath them together, and that the further you integrate yourself within their society or culture, if you can call it that, often involves being augmented with technology and losing parts of you that make up your identity, not only as an individual, but with whatever species you are. The only major exception would be the advisor, since they have minimal augments, but they do have some. But they are also kept as super powerful babies, so This even extends to striders, gunships, dropships, and hunters, as well as crab and mortar synths, and the advisor pod and shield scanners. These aren't creatures in the sense of the word that we're used to, but they are all synthetic organisms. Although it is debatable if the hunter is a synth or cyborg, since it can sort of bleed and be disintegrated with a combined energy ball, which only happens to organic matter. After all, you've never seen an energy ball dissolve a house, so it could also explain why they have such a hard time integrating the Vortigons, since the Vortessence cannot simply be integrated with through technology. But there's a lot of blending technology and organics present in the Combine, and given everything, I have a hard time believing that those at the top are even technically alive at this point. So that's not to say that they ever were, but it seems possible that they never were. That is, like a fully synthetic or artificial race, and in that replacing the organics of the species beneath them, they are literally integrating themselves with the creatures until nothing remains, slowly eroding their individuality until they become a new entity. That in it of itself is scarier than just a giant interdimensional empire seeking to take control of everything. You know, that there is no real bad guy or villain to fight and blame, but instead a collective existential threat. Wow, that was dark. I also have other theories, I suppose, regarding them, and such as the gigantic bacteriophage that they had G-Men kept in, or all the medical terminology they use. There is a lot to unpack there, and it is very interesting. Perhaps I'll delve into other theories down the road after I've done more research on them. But for now, let's switch back to something less dark and equally as speculative. So, given everything I've laid out about the G-Man, what do I think will happen in Half-Life 3? Well, it's really hard to say, given it is the interest of the G-Man and his employers to have the teleportation device on the Borealis destroyed. Unless Valve decides to change the ship's cannon, I can't see it sitting well with fans if it directly mirrors Epistle 3. Even then, Gordon, Eli, and Dog still want to free Alyx. I don't see G-Man directly plopping her back in just to destroy it. She'd be too likely to disobey him. And a 5-minute cameo seems a little off-putting. They could always use Adrian Shepard for the part, but it still wouldn't solve things with Alyx and could very well prevent him from showing up in future installments. I can see them wresting the Borealis from the Combine and individually destroying it, and or using it or the Vortigons to go back to Zen. However, narratively, I think it would be much more exciting if the humans fail to stop the Combine. Either whatever Combine force that is left decides to use the ship to travel to Zen, which, wouldn't make sense with such a small force, or they take it back to the Combine homeworld. And again, now they have the ability to travel through space and time. I'd love it if they, while still not really understanding portals, use it to rip open a huge hole through space and time, threading the fabric of whatever it is that is binding all these universes to Zen, and through whatever convoluted means humanity has to stop them. Or perhaps G-Man makes some sort of deal with the humans and decides to employ Alyx. Regardless, she's going to have to take on a much more prominent role in the game, being her father's main driving force now, and given that the Vortigons remark how she is tied to Gordon, I presume that the presence will be greater in the game too, and more being revealed about the Vortigons and the Vortessence. After all, they're the only ones who prove to have the capability of hindering the G-Man in any way. I can't see us being able to outright destroy him. In fact, everything might eventually play into his hand. This is a story that has been written by him from the very start. After all, if the Vortigons were to destroy him, it's going to require a lot of them, or some kind of great sacrifice. After all, the Vortigons powering the vault could barely contain him. The device on the Borealis might be able to, if it works how it did in Epistle 3. It turned into a bomb, and it would be an explosion across not just space, but also time. Again, I don't see any of this being very likely. Will either play into his hands or prove to be too much of a nuisance to be bothered with. And as for the Combine, it's hard to say. One reason I favor the possibility of them succeeding in getting control of the Borealis is that it would take Earth off their radar. They would have the technology that they would have wanted this entire time, and their main forces can be redirected towards Zen, which would be much more important to them. If they don't, it's hard to say. If I recall, portal storms still ravage the Earth from time to time, leaving it a possibility that they could always come back to Earth, unless perhaps we somehow destroy their capability to travel universes, which the G-Man might like. Either way, I see it likely that Zen makes a reappearance somehow. Everything ties back to it. Now, I do apologize if any of this is confusing, and I'm speaking in vague terms that are merely possibilities and maybes. Given that this is all speculative, I simply cannot say anything for certain, especially since time has shown to be a very flexible thing. Nothing that hasn't happened can't be said to ever happen, and everything that has happened can only be said to have been thus far. But a closer approximation to what I'm predicting for Half-Life 3 is that Alyx will, obviously, be more pivotal, and we will probably see a lot more interactions with the Vortigaunts. We may go back to Zen, and the nature of space and time will likely become very confusing. Much more so than that cannot be said for certain. Even if it's all speculative, I could very well be wrong. In fact, part of me hopes that I am, and that everything in this video is completely wrong, only because it would be very interesting to see what is true instead. And if I were to accidentally predict Half-Life 3 and reveal the secrets of the hidden narrative in these games, it probably would prompt Valve to rewrite everything and delay Half-Life 3 even further, which I really don't want. Valve, if you see this and you need a writer, I am free and interested. Anything to get the game finished and to meet and exceed everyone's expectations. Although, if I am right about any of my crazy theories, you, watching this right now, you owe me a sub and a share. If I'm wrong, please call me out anyway. Even though an obsessive amount of research was done for this, really it's all in good fun and to prompt people to just view their favorite works from different perspectives and to search for hidden narratives. You know, the Soulsborne fans are probably laughing at me right now. And with Half-Life, I assure you that there is hidden narratives, whether or not it was intentional. In fact, part of me wants to make an investigative video to figure out who really ate all the donuts, because I'm almost certain it could be done. So again, to recap everything, I am theorizing that the G-Man and his employers are a much more advanced alien race, if they can even be referred to as such, that seek to control the cosmos by preventing other civilizations from obtaining teleportation technology, and by extension, access to Zen. Then, on top of it all, the G-Men, who very well could be a cosmological, thematic devil, and that there is no true combined race, that they are a technology that is defined and identified by their ability to combine with other species. Also, quick side note, the Combine aren't actually called the Universal Union. Breen just said that once in speech. That name wasn't even capitalized in the subtitles, and Mark Laylaw doesn't even remember calling them that. So anyway, I have tried to cite as many sources as I can throughout the video. However, I will link to all of my sources and references in the description or a pinned comment down below. Seriously, please don't take anything I say at face value. Look at the information yourself and leave a comment or make a video letting me know your thoughts. If you enjoyed this, please give it a like, sub, and share with others. Let us know what you'd like to see next. It may or may not be Half-Life. I only did it because Valve wouldn't, and this has been bugging me for the past 16 or so years. In the meantime,
This is where I get off.